Let's say I handed you a heavily tinted set of glasses to wear. What would happen to everything that you see? Let's say the glasses, the lenses in the glasses are tinted red. Then everything you would see would be red. And of course, if the lenses were blue, everything you would see is blue. And if they were yellow, everything you would see is yellow. In a very similar way, wearing Christian lenses changes the way you see every single thing in this world. When you possess Christ, when you have Christ through faith in Him, it changes the way you see marriage. It changes the way you see children, parenting, relationships, recreation, work, education. As a Christian, you see the beginning of life differently. As a Christian, you see the end of life differently. When you put on your Christian glasses, it affects the way you see money. It affects the way you see time. It affects the way you see adversity. In short, wearing glasses that are Christ-colored changes everything. Today, in our second lesson, we're going to see how that plays out in the life of the Apostle Paul. Now, as Paul is writing this letter to the congregation at Philippi, he is chained to a Roman soldier 24 hours a day. He is waiting to go on trial for telling people about Jesus Christ. He doesn't know what the outcome is going to be. He does not have a crystal ball. He does not really know what's going to happen to him next. Well, he has a general idea. One of two things is going to happen. Either he is going to plead his case and he is going to be found not guilty and he is going to be allowed to go back and to do what he had been doing. Or he is going to be found guilty and then summarily executed. Those were the two outcomes that were going to happen in his life. Now, you would think that Paul would heavily favor one of those two outcomes as better than another. His head is literally on the line here. But because Paul is wearing his Christian glasses and it changes the way he sees things, he doesn't see his circumstances in that way. He doesn't look at having a bad one of those is a bad outcome and one of those is a good outcome. Let's allow Paul to explain it to you in his own words. Paul writes, "Because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul is reminding the Philippians, and he's reminding us too, that he is a Christian. And that changes the way he looks at the world. Paul no longer lives for himself. He lives for Christ. He wants only what is good for Christ. Paul has put Christ in the very center of his life. Paul no longer lives for his own glory or for his own benefit. Paul wants to magnify Christ, to make him larger for other people. Paul wants to glorify Christ so that when people see Paul, they don't see Paul, they see Jesus. So Paul is now living life with his Christian glasses perched firmly on his nose. Listen to how it shades what he sees. He says, "Now as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death." What Paul is saying is that it doesn't matter what happens. Whether he lives or whether he dies, as long as he glorifies Christ in his life or in his death, that's what ultimately matters. He continues, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what should I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." Paul saw no difference between the two doors that were in front of him. Whether door number one led to his execution or door number one led to his release, they were essentially the same to him. If the Roman emperor freed him, he could continue to preach Christ. And Paul described that as fruitful labor for me. So if he got out of prison and he went back to his missionary work, Paul said, "That's a win in my book. That's a good thing." And if he died, that would also be a win in his book. Paul described it as a gain. If he died as a martyr, it would testify to his faith in Christ. If he died for preaching and telling other people about Jesus, it would tell many people that there are some things in this life that are worth dying for. That's a win. Either way, Christ is magnified. Heads I win, tails I win. He actually did see a slight difference between the two options that were in front of him, the two outcomes. He wrote, "I desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is better by far." So in Paul's mind, or at least when he's got his Christian glasses firmly on his nose, to have his head lopped off and to spill his blood for Jesus was actually better by far than being set free. Paul explained himself to the Philippian Christians. He basically said, if I'm executed and I die, I go to be with Christ. You could put it this way. To live was Christ. To die was more Christ. He couldn't lose. He was already forgiven. He was already saved. He was already the apple of God's eye. Jesus had already done all that needed to be done for Paul on the cross and at the empty grave. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Now, as Paul spends his time in jail, he's got a lot of time to think about the two outcomes, how this is going to work out, what's going to happen. And again, he doesn't really know what's going to happen. He doesn't have a crystal ball. And yet here he kind of, in the text, he asks himself a rhetorical question. A question that really he doesn't expect an answer to. He says, "Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." So basically, Paul is saying, I don't really know what's going to happen, but if I could choose between whether God takes me home to heaven or whether he lets me go and to continue my ministry, I would prefer that he would leave my head on my neck so that I could go back to you and I could share the gospel more with you. Paul explained, "Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your joy in Christ Jesus will overflow on account of me." Now, Paul is looking at his situation and he believes that he is going to be found innocent. He, in his mind, is predicting that he's going to be set free and allowed to go back to care for the sheep that God has given him. He is pretty convinced that his life is going to go back to normal. But he doesn't know for sure. At the end of the day, he concludes, it really doesn't matter. That's why he says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel. So what mattered to Paul wasn't the outcome. Either way, he was going to win. But what did matter to Paul, as he's writing to these beloved Christians in Philippi, is that they also put their Christian glasses firmly on their nose, so that they see life through Christ in the same way that he does. Paul wants these believers to live their lives as Christians, to live their life in such a way that Christ is glorified, to set an example with the way that they live their life in every part of their life, every aspect of their life, not just when they go to church, but in the way they conduct themselves in their marriage, the way they conduct themselves at the grocery store, the way they conduct themselves at their place of employment, the way they behave themselves out in public, everywhere. He says, I want it so that you glorify and magnify Christ, so that when people see you, they don't see you anymore, they see Jesus. And as long as you do that, it doesn't matter what happens. Like Paul, each one of us here tonight finds ourselves in a win-win situation. Heads you win, tails you win. It doesn't matter. Because by His grace, God has made it so that whether you live and you glorify Christ with your living, that's going to be a win. Or whether you die and you go home to be with Christ, that's also going to be a win. We have nothing to be afraid of. We can rejoice either way. We can be confident as Paul when he wrote, "What has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. To live is Christ. To die is more Christ." How can you lose? So brothers and sisters, remember this when you are anxious about the future. Remember this when you find yourself standing at a set of closed doors in front of you, and you really don't know what's behind those closed doors. And there are some good outcomes and some not so good outcomes on the other side. Remember this when Satan comes around and tries to convince you that God will never let someone like you into His heaven. That you sinned too much, doubted Him too often, failed Him at every turn. Remember this when you are in the ambulance on the way to the hospital and you just don't know how it's all going to turn out. God has made it by giving you faith in Jesus, so that in Christ you can't lose. May God give you the conviction that He gave to Paul. And may God help you to keep your Christ-colored glasses perched firmly on your nose, so that everything you look at is filtered through Him. Amen.